Hi, everyone. This is Professor Nguyen, and I want to welcome you back to another fantastic week that we have here that we are going on into. I believe this is now our sixth week in terms of the shelter in place. So I hope that you are safe at home, staying in shelter, practicing social distancing, and also keeping your sanity, right? Because as you can tell, America, and also includes California as well, guys. There's a sense of cabin fever that we somewhat feel kind of trapped into our home, and that you have recent protests happening in Michigan, in Minnesota, but also here in California as well, of people protesting the current shelter in place. There was even one um, protest sign that I read. It says social distancing equals communism, right? Take it from me, guys. I grew up in Vietnam. My family, we come from Vietnamese immigrant background. Brothers fled in the 80s to escape communism. I can tell you this right now, that when your government asks you to stay at home and is paying you to not work and just relax, and as an effort to protect your safety and livelihood, that is not what communism is, guys. I can tell you that right now, because if this truly was a communist society, I promise you, those protests would have never happened in the first place. We would never even read about it, and the hashtag Florida morons would not go somewhat viral on social media. But that's another story. On that, I want to welcome you back into another interesting week. We pick up looking at the experience of African Americans. I hope that in the last lecture, in last week's lecture, I have highlighted to you the experiences of African Americans in the mid 19th century during the Reconstruction period, um, as a result of the passage of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment that abolished slavery, bestowed citizenship on African Americans, and also expanded somewhat their rights to vote. And you can make an argument that Reconstruction itself was the rise of Black political power, the rise of Black freedom, and Black power in particular. But unfortunately, what we do know in American history is that anytime when you have rise of Black anything, Black anything, there is somewhat a white backlash. And that's exactly what happened in the second half of the 19th century. You have discrimination, you have disfranchisement, and of course, violence and terrorism, right? So this is where we want to pick up looking at African Americans. Again, quick recap for you. Southerners will try to exploit loopholes within the 13th Amendment by criminalizing people for simply being Black, right? That it became a crime for you to steal a pig, steal anything that was over $20, or I shouldn't say it's a crime. Of course, stealing is a crime, but the type of punishment that is usually reserved for each specific crime becomes very somewhat broad or somewhat expansive, right? You have somewhat African Americans prevented from traveling. You have African Americans prevented from serving on jury. You have African Americans being taxed simply because they have to get a special license in order for them to do business. You have discriminatory lending practices from the banks and also from landowners. We talk about sharecropping, right? We talked about vagrancy laws, that it became a crime for you to be unemployed. It became a crime for you to be homeless. It became a crime for you to somewhat go broke, right? It became a crime for you to accumulate debt, right? The reason behind why crime became somewhat so expansive, or somewhat the definition of what a crime was became so expansive, especially after the 1860s, is simply because we do know that law enforcement or the criminal justice system can be used to somewhat oppress minorities in particular. And that's exactly what happens, guys, is that you have a skewing of the criminal justice system, especially after the 1860s. And as a result, you have an expansion of the prison system. And we talked about the convict leasing programs, where you have African Americans being hired out by the prison system to do hard labor for local businesses, in particular, the plantation, the railroads, mining companies in particular. And as a result, it creates somewhat exploitations of African Americans for their labor due to somewhat the accusation of or the conviction of being a criminal, right? So you have an expansion of what it means of crimes, right? African Americans are somewhat profiled, targeted, and convicted, and eventually hired out for cheap. Okay, so we talked about the stripping of the 13th Amendment, mass incarceration, convict leasing program, right, as a way to exploit and trap African Americans on the land itself. And then we talked about the stripping of the 14th Amendment with the separation but equal clause that was established with the Plessy versus Ferguson case that occurred in 1896, where you basically have the court says it's okay to separate people as long as you provide equal facilities. But what we do know is that, unfortunately, those facilities were not quite equal, okay? So you have the dismantling of the 14th Amendment, where equal protection is no longer enforced before the law. The Supreme Court basically says it's okay to discriminate on people as long as it's on an individual basis. And then last but not least, you have the 15th Amendment, where stripping African Americans of their rights to vote. We talked about the poll tax. We talked about which was a tax for you to vote because most African Americans were poor. We also talked about the literacy test. The literacy test, where it was a test in order for you to somewhat vote. Unfortunately, most African Americans were illiterate. And last but not least, you have the cream of the crop of it all, the grandfather clause, where basically it says if your grandfather was a slave, ultimately you do not get to vote. All right. How successful were these mechanisms? More than 90% successful. Was that you have turnout votes. The turnout for African Americans vote decreased by as much as 90% in various Southern localities. And the question becomes, how was all of this possible, right? Segregation, disfranchisement, all of it possible to put African Americans in their place. I talked to you about the practice of lynchings in the South as a way to reinforce white authority, white supremacy, and through violence and terror, the same ingredients, practices that was used during slavery to somewhat keep African Americans in their place, once again, rear its ugly head, once again in the 1890s, as thousands of African Americans are going to lose their lives at the end of a rope. And I made an argument that lynchings itself was not somewhat a isolated, secretive form of terror that occurred in the middle of the night. This was wide out in the open. This was an open attraction. This was a regional attraction to recruit and to get more people to come down to the South itself, right? So that's what we somewhat talked about. And here's where I want to shift gears. Here's where we pick up, guys, is that I hope you have understand so far the challenges that African Americans had to face after the 1860s. Now, as it relates to your midterm number 2, how does this compare to the struggle that women had to overcome after the mid-19th century as well? Well, we can tell that ultimately, when it comes to voting rights, that was something that African Americans somewhat struggle for as well, right? That you have women fighting for their right to vote, whereas African Americans were simply fighting for their right to vote. In terms of getting the law to be enforced, right? Because you got to remember the 15th Amendment, when it was passed, it did not include women. So what you have was women were fighting to simply add themselves on, right? Or add themselves to be included upon this very crucial amendment that bestowed voting rights upon somewhat African Americans. Whereas African Americans, even though they're fighting for their rights to vote, they are simply fighting, right, for the US government to simply enforce the law. That is it, right? This is the trouble when it comes to understanding African Americans and their quest for civil rights. Because the criticism today towards African Americans is like, oh, African Americans, once again, right? They're portraying themselves to be victim and they want to ask for certain handouts and certain benefits. And this is primarily a complaint that comes from somewhat white America as to why African Americans keep complaining and complaining about discrimination and race and about somewhat access to services. Why can't they just be like us and just go to work and ultimately thrive and achieve social mobility, right? But what African Americans, if you look at their experience, they are not asking for anything extra, right? They are not asking for anything extra. All they're really asking for is to be treated equally and to have their government enforce a law that is on the books, right? Because if you look at it, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, those are laws within America, right? Abolish slavery, equal protection before the law, and ultimately the ability to go vote, right? So when African Americans are fighting for their civil rights, again, guys, they're not fighting for privilege, right? They are not fighting for anything extra that other people do not have. They are simply fighting for something that they had earned, okay? That was promised to them, okay? But the problem is what you have is white America turning its back on African Americans. And as a result, this is going to be another century-long struggle that African Americans will have to fight for. And so I hope you understand the similarities and differences. Yes, both groups, women, African Americans, fighting for their rights to vote. Whereas women, they want simply to be added on, right? They are fighting for an additional right that did not include them. Whereas African Americans, they are simply arguing for a right that they have already earned. And they're simply asking their government to enforce the law that was already passed. So I hope you somewhat understand that. But I also hope you understand that when it comes to African Americans, the issues that they were fighting for or the challenges that they were facing for is a little different from that of women. It's not just about their right to vote, but this is also their right to just simply stay alive, right? Their right to live. Because what you have is that you have the rise of domestic terrorism in America with lynchings. And as a result, this is a very unique problem that African Americans, not white women, are going to have to face. Now, I understand that there are parallels, right? Some of you are probably wondering, well, there are Black women out there too, Professor Nguyen. So isn't that mean that they somewhat face yes, I understand that there are Black women out there as well. And that's even a bigger somewhat barrier for African American women to go through, because not only do they have to overcome race, but they also have to overcome gender as well. So of course, I understand there could be overlap between the two, right? But we are focusing on African Americans. And I ended it last week's lecture somewhat really proposing this question that I simply asked, or I asked the question, well, if you're an African American in the South and you're watching all of this play out, what is your response? Okay. And I know it's easy with hindsight and say, well, they should have protested. They should have marched out in the streets, right? They should have fought for their rights. Well, here lies the problem, guys. Remember that story I shared with you about Charlie Holcomb, right? I share with you the story of Charlie Holcomb. It's simply because his story represents the majority of the responses that African Americans are going to somewhat use as a way to somewhat deals with the rise of lynchings, segregation, and discrimination in the South. It's accommodation. And the reason why I share with you that story, because again, it's probably the easiest solution for African Americans to simply comply and put up with what's happening. But I think also in logistic terms as well, right? I asked you the question, okay, if you decide that the South is not for you, where the hell are you gonna go? Right? Again, the North is not that much better, and there's really not that much out there in the West. And second of all, what are you willing to leave behind? Your family, your community, right? That is somewhat the challenge that African Americans are going to have to deal with. So what are we doing today? what we are going to look at today is I want to look at the responses to the rise of white supremacy and also segregation in the South. And I share with you the story of Charlie Holcomb. It's simply because, again, I wanted to highlight what we call a response, what we call accommodation, right? Because you can either fight, right, or you can accommodate. Now, here's where I want to look at Booker T. Washington in particular, because if we look at Booker T. Washington, it's a very sad story because Booker T. Washington was one of the most influential, if not the most influential leader for African Americans in the late 19th century, right? Booker T. Washington. And unfortunately, simply because of time and how things sort of play out, and especially with the civil rights movement in the 1960s, Booker T. Washington, unfortunately, as of today, does not get enough credit for his contribution and also his achievement as well. It's simply because his response to accommodate to the New South, as it was called, it seemed as very passive, right? We don't celebrate for people when hardship comes up and racism come up and your response is, I'll just comply and I'll just accommodate. That's not really somewhat resistance. That's more of a response, right? So we don't really somewhat celebrate that in a modern sense, right? It's not really aggressive enough. It's not really somewhat active enough for many of us. But you have to also understand is that for many individuals, they're going to try to make the best out of their circumstance. And what you have, this is all about perspective, guys, right? And it's also about, is it about the rhetoric of your strategy, all right? Or is this about actual progress? Because that's what it's about. This is what the conversation, this is what the debate over the civil rights movement is about, right? Very similar to how women's suffrage disagree in terms of their strategy. Are we going to focus in the States? Are we going to focus on Washington, D.C.? So you can see that women somewhat disagree in terms of how to get there, right? They know that they want to get to equality. They want to get to their right to vote, but it's the strategy that you use in terms of how you are going to get there. That's where women differ. And African Americans are no different, guys. African Americans are not monolithic. Just because they are Black doesn't mean that they all get along, right? Similar to many other minority groups in particular, okay? And oftentimes, what is it that we should celebrate? Should we celebrate a person's ideology, or should we celebrate an individual and what they actually accomplish? Because I think if you look at Booker T. Washington in terms of ideology, I don't know if there's much to celebrate, right? Because he's basically calling on African Americans, look, guys, suck it up, right? And just accommodate. Because that's what he said. He basically called on African Americans to accommodate to the New South. But Booker T. Washington is looking at somewhat at the benefit analysis, because by accommodating, what he is hoping is that in exchange, Southerners, in exchange for African Americans accommodating, white Southerners, what he's hoping is that they will extend and give opportunities to African Americans for new jobs, access to education, right, to allow them to have an income. And if they can have an income, then that way they can support themselves, sustain themselves, right? So that's what his ideology is about. Let's accommodate. It's kind of like that, what's that saying? You can get more with honey than with vinegar, right? You can catch more fly with honey than vinegar, right? Honey meaning it's something sweet, right? Vinegar, it's something a little bit more pungent, a little bit more sour. So that's somewhat the metaphor that I use when it comes to Booker T. Washington. Now, why does he have somewhat that that ideology? Well, number one, he's from the South, okay? Number two, he was a former slave. So who else would know Southerners best than he does, okay? And ultimately, that's what Booker T. Washington does, is that he calls upon African Americans to ultimately really accommodate. And what he's hoping is that in the era of resurging white supremacy, racial violence, and also changing economic conditions because you have industrialization, what he's hoping for is that, again, by accommodating, Southerners will give Blacks jobs, access to education, so that way they can improve themselves economically, okay? Now, it may seem passive, but if you look at what actually Booker T. Washington accomplished, by far, nobody else is going to come closer to what he accomplished, okay? Here you have Booker T. Washington. He's able to open his own university, okay? To train African Americans the new skills that they are going to need in order for them to be successful in this new industrialized economy, okay? The university that he built is called the Tuskegee Institute. If you have watched any African-American war films, the Tuskegee Institute is one of the most popular institutions within somewhat Black films because, again, it was a university that allow African Americans to learn certain trades. It was also a university that really trained African Americans somewhat the new skills that they are going to need in order for them to survive. And guys, not only did he build a university, he also built this university in the middle of what I would consider Ku Klux Klan country, in the middle of Alabama. Okay, so he didn't build it in Chicago, right? He didn't build it in New York, right? Or even California, okay? He built it in the middle of Alabama. This is in the lion's den here that he's building his institution. And not only did he build a school, he built the largest university in Alabama, larger than even those of whites, okay? Let that sink in for a minute, okay? So he built a school, okay? He also was the first African Americans to be invited to the White House in 1901 to have dinner with President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, well, what's the big deal about that? Like, they're just having dinner. Not so fast, guys, okay? Now, it is not to say that Booker T. Washington was the first Black man to step foot on the White House. Obviously not, because, well, the White House was built by slaves, right? So if anything, there were plenty of Black people on somewhat the lawn area, if you will. But also, it was said that he was the first African Americans to be invited into the White House to have dinner. Now, this was a big deal, and it did not sit too well with Southerners because it was said that in the South, you do not invite somebody over to your home to have dinner with you unless you are willing to marry off your daughter to that person. So it's more of a hospitality type of, it's a sign of respect. Now, that is not to say that Theodore Roosevelt was somehow pro-Black or he's, pro-equality. No, he's not, right? No, Theodore Roosevelt was a racist. He believed that Black people, Asian, Native Americans, anything outside of white was inferior. So I want to make that clear, okay? But Theodore Roosevelt did believe that there were individuals within each of the races that were capable of being on equal footing as those of whites. So a race, no. Individuals, yes, okay? That were capable of equality, okay? So Booker T. Washington was the first Black man to have dinner in the White House. He built a university, okay? So is it ideology or is it progress that we measure an individual success by, right? When we go into Safeway during February, when we see those Black History Poster Month, okay? Do we celebrate a man based on his rhetoric, speech, ideology, or do we measure our leaders, whether they are men or women, based on the accomplishment that they achieved? Because if you look at Booker T. Washington's accomplishment, it is by far more accomplished than any of his somewhat counterpart at that time. Now, that is not to say that Booker T. Washington did not believe in resistance. No, he did, but he did it in somewhat subtle ways, okay? He did oppose Jim Crow. He did oppose unequal funding to somewhat Black facilities and Black institutions. He opposed discrimination in labor unions. He opposed segregated housing policies, but he never spoke of it, okay? He secretly hired people to do it for him, or he funneled money into other organizations, right? Kind of like let them do somewhat the dirty work, and while he keeps his somewhat, wholesome, accommodating, somewhat image to white America, right? But secretly behind closed doors, he was pulling the strings, funneling money into Black organization as a way for them to fight on the behalf of African Americans. So at the end of the day, right, what do we measure Booker T. Washington by, right? Is it his action, or is it his rhetoric or ideology? Okay, what is it going to be? And again, if you boil his message down to African Americans, it's not just about accommodation. Booker T. Washington preached an idea that taught African Americans to be responsible. He also emphasized in hard work, right? Education, living a moral, righteous life. And if African Americans practice somewhat those ideas and concepts and principles, hard work, going to school, living a righteous life, being responsible for themselves and their community, it would ultimately bring them a degree of freedom, success, and independence, even in a time of oppression. That in the pursuit of excellence, it would bring Blacks an economic currency in the larger world and ultimately earn the respect and equality from white America. Right? So he's kind of making the argument like, look, just go to work, okay? Work hard, live a respectable life, make money, and ultimately you will achieve success. And once you achieve success, we will prove to white America that we are worthy. Again, this is going to be the reason why Booker T. Washington is not going to be widely celebrated. He's kind of seen as a sellout within the African American community, simply because, again, he's not calling them to fight back. He's calling them to accommodate, and he's simply calling them to just be respectable, right? As a way to earn white America trust. So that's Booker T. Washington. I'll get back to Booker T. Washington in a little bit, but he's not the only response. Okay, there are other responses as well. You have W.E.B. Du Bois. This is another somewhat influential African-American leaders in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, he disagreed with Booker T. Washington. And part of the reason why he disagreed is that, again, W.E.B. Du Bois, let me see here. I'm sorry. W.E.B. Du Bois, he's not from the South. He's from the North. W.E.B. Du Bois was also very talented. He was also very educated, very smart. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first African Americans to earn his PhD at Harvard. Okay, so he was very somewhat smart, affluent, middle class Northerner, which was different from Booker T. Washington, right? Booker T. Washington was a former slave. He grew up in the South, right? He kind of knows the landscape. But for W.E.B. Du Bois, he is somewhat coming from, I want to say, an academic perspective in this sense. W.E.B. Du Bois is making an argument that economic success and respectability in hard work is not enough. Or it's somewhat of a flawed strategy. Because why? Because history has shown time after time and time again, when African Americans are successful economically, okay, there comes white resentment. And when white resentment happens, it leads to violence and terror. And at any given moment, Black success can be stripped, taken away, okay, at any given moment. Where's the proof? If you guys remember the story of Ida B. Wells and her and her best friend wanting to open his grocery store. Remember what happened when they became too successful, that African Americans started to patronize and support the People's Grocery Store, as it was called? The owners, right, were taken down to the river and ultimately lynched. And that's W.E.B. Du Bois's argument, that it's not enough just to be successful economically, that African Americans needed to protect their wealth, needed to protect their success. And how do you do that, right? You do that by agitating, right, and using the legal system to ultimately to get the US government to enforce the law that is already on the books, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. So W.E.B. Du Bois, he disagrees with Washington that it's about economic success and that ultimately that is how you're going to earn white America somewhat respect and earn your equality. W.E.B. Du Bois is making an argument, no, that's not it, right? Of course you have to be economically successful, but you also have to fight for your civil rights. Rights that you have as a citizen, but get the government to enforce it. So this is going to be the reason why the two of them, guys, they're not really going to get along. They differ in terms of their ideology, in terms of their strategy. And again, is there a right or a wrong here? I wouldn't say so. I would just say that it's going to take all strategies in order for you to accomplish your goal. And then every individual can only do what is best within their circumstance, okay? And also, every individual response is shaped by their experience, okay? And that's why I highlight Booker T. Washington is from the South, right? W.E.B. Du Bois is from the North, okay? They're coming from different regions, different backgrounds here, guys, even though both of them were African Americans. But that is not to discredit W.E.B. Du Bois and his achievement. No, W.E.B. Du Bois is going to be one of the founder of the NAACP. Right, the NAACP, which is the national for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's what the letters stand for, the NAACP. And the NAACP, it is founded in 1905, and from 1905 to 1954, the NAACP is going to be the main force to defend African Americans in the court system, right? So they're going to use the legal strategy, as I like to call it, right? They're mainly going to hire lawyers, right, to go fight on the behalf of African Americans in the court system as a way to somewhat reinforce those constitutional rights, 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, to protect African Americans and their rights. Right? Whereas Booker T. Washington, it's about focusing on economics, right? It's about, let's just focus on getting jobs, making an income, and ultimately living a respectable life, right? So there's no right or wrong strategy here. This is just purely doing what is best in your circumstance, okay? So those are the early response to the rise of segregation. And here's where I want to shift gears once again. This is where an opportunity is going to open up. If you guys remember when we talked about should America be the world's policeman? And I had made an argument in class. I challenged some of you liberals out there in class. I said, you know, I know you guys don't want to hear this, but wars in America are actually really good for people of color in particular. Because what it does is that it gives people of color an opportunity to fight for their freedom, to fight for their equality, but also for African American guys, wars are going to be a good opportunity for them to get the hell out of the South. It is that simple, guys. Because again, when we ask the question, okay, so if you want to leave, where are you going to go? By World War One, the grass may be greener outside of the South. And this is where you're going to have is that starting in 1914, all the way up until 1970. Yeah, that's right, folks, 1970. Okay? You are going to have millions. Let's see, where's the statistics I have here? I believe it is more than 7 million African Americans are going to migrate outside of the South, starting from World War One. Because what you're going to have is that by World War One, I believe it's around, I think it's around like 200,000. And then by World War II, it's another 500,000. And that number is going to continue to rise even after World War II. But we call the Great Migration, it starts in World War I. Oh, I'm sorry, I have the statistics here for you. 1910 to 1970, the combination of World War I, World War II, and also the Cold War up until 1970, more than 6 million African Americans are going to move out of the South, and they are going to go into the North and into the West. Because why? They just want to get the hell out of the South. Number two, there's opportunity to work in the war industries, okay? In the factories, right? The war manufacturing industry. So they're going into the North during World War I. They're going into the West during World War II. So you have this migration. But what you also have during World War I is you also have African Americans signing up for the military as well. More than 370,000 African Americans are going to enlist in the military. And it's somewhat a very sad story. They are fighting for democracy, but they are serving in a segregated army, okay? African Americans had to be segregated, and African Americans were somewhat given the worst jobs, given the worst duties in somewhat the military. But those who were able to somewhat see frontline action served bravely, and they were celebrated for their courage. It was said that African Americans, World War I really empowered them. It really empowered them because why? If you think about it, guys, if you've been through war, what else worse could you been through, right? Like you already put your life on the line, okay? And then on top of that, these guys here, African Americans, they're actually celebrated and they are beloved when they were in Europe. It was said that in France, Parisians in particular, these are the people that live in Paris, they love African American soldiers because African American soldiers were viewed as liberators, were viewed as allies. It was said that on a French city bus in the city of Paris, it was a crowded bus. You had an African American soldier getting on the bus. It was a crowded bus. There were no seats left on the bus. And a white woman stood up, gave up her seat to allow this black soldier so he can rest his feet. Right? That was what was happening in France. Do you think that would have happened in America, right? If anything, it's quite the opposite in America, right? It would be the black man who would have to stand up, or at least, a black woman who would have to stand up to give up her seat for a white male passenger, right? We're talking about Rosa Parks and everything of that nature. Okay, but it's quite the opposite. So what you have was that African Americans, they're empowered by the war experience. They already put their life on the front line. Okay, I call it baptism by fire, right? They already seen hell, right, on the front line through somewhat the violence of war. And then on top of that, they are beloved and they are celebrated by their European allies. It was said that the French, they wanted to have a parade in the city of Paris, and they actually invited African Americans to join them in this parade, but it was very last minute that you have the president of America, Woodrow Wilson, stepping in, intervening, and banning African Americans to march in this parade because it was quoted that he says, "I don't want to give them a feeling of being equal." Okay, so that was the words of the president during World War I. So as a result, Woodrow, African Americans did not get to participate in the post-war parade in Europe, and when they got back home, they were not treated any better as well. Okay, because once they came back home, remember, guys, the 1920s, it's about what? It's about returning to normalcy. And what does normalcy mean? It means putting African Americans back in their place. So here's where I want to highlight another somewhat example of what happened when African American soldiers came home from the war, how they were treated, and also what happened when African Americans become too successful. Now, this was one of those forgotten history in American history, the Tulsa riot. Very little people know about the Tulsa riot, but recently the Tulsa riot has somewhat made a resurgence. And I don't know how many of you out there have watched the latest somewhat HBO series. I don't know how many of you are a fan of The Watchmen. So I'm a fan of The Watchmen. I read the comic in a cultural class back in my days in college. I also watched the movie The Watchmen. So I'm a huge fan of what it represents. It's kind of dark, twisted look at superheroes in a sense. But HBO recently, they came out with a show. It's called The Watchmen, and it's a follow-up to somewhat the comic book itself. And in The Watchmen, it starts off with the Tulsa massacre. So I'm happy to see that finally America is having a reckoning with somewhat some of the darkest chapters in its American history. But let me give you the backdrop to what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So May 31st, 1921, violence broke out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Once again, what you had was an accusation that a black man by the name of Dick Rowland was falsely accused of raping a white woman in an elevator. But what makes this story different is that not because of the accusation of rape or anything like that, but where the violence had occurred. Because Tulsa in May 1921 was nicknamed by America, or had a nickname that was called Black Wall Street. It was called Black Wall Street because it was home to a thriving African American community, home to some of the richest families in America at the time, home to not one, not two, but 3 black millionaires. That is the equivalent of Jay-Z, right? P. Diddy, Sean Diddy Combs, or as I like to call him, Puff Daddy, okay? And LeBron James, right? Living all on the same block, okay? That's the equivalent of today. Now, if you're wondering, how the hell did these black families get so rich out in Tulsa, Oklahoma? The answer is oil, okay? There was an oil boom in the early 20th century. African Americans made their way out to Tulsa, Oklahoma, tapped into somewhat the oil, and got rich off of it. So they made money, they owned businesses. Just to give you an idea of how rich they became, guys, some of these families own private planes with their own private runway. This was before airplanes was even commercialized for civilians. That is the equivalent of Jay-Z, Puff Daddy, LeBron James living on the same corner and also owning a spaceship today. That's what Tulsa, Oklahoma was, guys. That's why it was called Black Wall Street. Now, the problem that you have was that black success comes white resentment. Because even though Dick Rowland was acquitted somewhat of rape, it did not matter to the mob. Because what you have was the whites at the Tulsa courthouse, they decided to take actions into their own hands. So what they decided to do was they were just going to lynch Dick Rowland anyways, regardless of the acquittal. But what you have was that in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you also had a large African American population and also a large group of African American men who had served during World War I. So what does that mean? They know how to organize. They know how to get information. They're also armed and strapped, okay? And then on top of that, right, they went to war to fight for democracy. So now all they got to do is fight for democracy at home. So make a long story short, you have 1,000 African-American veterans, many of them World War I. They show up at the courthouse. They try to rescue Dick Rowland, right, from the mob. All of a sudden, shots rang out. Or, I'm sorry, exchanges, shouting occur. Shots rang out. You have several of black bodies on the ground and one white man dead. What happens next is the worst race riot in American history. Because what you start to have is hysteria and panic spreads in both communities, white and blacks, to arm themselves and go to war. So what you have was police officers, what they started to do is they started to deputize civilians, meaning that they're just giving out guns to anybody that was willing to go fight on their behalf. So you have police officers, they start to hand out guns to members of the white mob, and they even call in the National Guard, right? This is somewhat the state military, if you will. So they call that in, and on the black side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, you have African Americans in particular gathering, organizing, and arming themselves for what's about to come. And on June 1st, 1921, you have more than 1,500 whites arming themselves, right? They drive down to Greenwood. This was the black section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they began their assault. 40 square blocks consisting of more than 1,000 homes, churches, schools, businesses were looted and set on fire. As many as 300 blacks lost their lives and 20 whites perished as a result of this riot. Now, what makes the Tulsa riot different is that it's not the first race riot in America, guys. No, there's been plenty of race riots in America. You can even date back to the Memphis riot in the 1860s, where it's the same situation. You got police officers, they're just deputizing civilians, giving out guns, so that way they can go somewhat spread violence and hate. But what makes the Tulsa riot different is, well, I want to read to you a passage that was written by an African-American lawyer. His name is John Franklin, and he described what he saw outside of his office that day. And it reads, okay, let me get a little bit of water here. Okay, guys, it reads, I could see the planes circling in midair. They grew in number and hummed. They darted and dipped low. I could hear something falling like hail, falling from the top of my office building. Lurid flames roared and belched, licked their forked tongues in the air. Smoke ascended the sky in thick black volumes. And amid it all, the planes. Now a dozen of them, more in number, still hummed and darted here and there with the agility of natural birds in the air. The sidewalks were literally covered with burning turpentine balls of fire. I knew all too well where they came from, and I knew all too well why every burning building first caught from the top. Okay? So what is he describing here, guys? John Franklin is making an observation that there's something going on in the air, and that the buildings themselves, the fire was not coming from the bottom, but the fire was coming from the top of the building. Make a long story short, whites in Tulsa, Oklahoma didn't just use their cars, they didn't just use their guns, but they also used airplanes to drop firebombs upon Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They're using planes to terrorize and kill Black citizens on American soil. More than 300 lives were lost. 10,000 people were homeless. 6,000 were detained, 1,200 Black businesses were burned to the ground, approximately $1.5 million in damage, okay? That's the toll that took on Black Wall Street. Tulsa, Oklahoma never recovered from this riot. Black Wall Street was not again possible because of the destruction. And the reason why I share the Tulsa, Oklahoma riot is because there's only been a few times in American history where you have people using planes as a way to terrorize American citizens on the ground. There's only been a couple of other instances. One, Pearl Harbor. Okay, this is where you have the Japanese, right, attacking Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy in Hawaii. But even then, you can make an argument that Hawaii itself is not an American state. It's not part of the mainland, right? That was a military operation. Fine. The only other example that we have of planes being used to terrorize people on the ground on American soil is September 11th. Okay, that was when the hijackers, right, these terrorists came in, right, and crashed into the Twin Towers. The only other example we have, guys, is Tulsa, Oklahoma. But the only difference is between Tulsa, Oklahoma and also 9/11 is that in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it was Americans who were the ones who were the terrorists. Not foreigners, it was Americans, okay? So that is an example of Tulsa, Oklahoma. So if you're wondering why African Americans would want to get the hell out of the South, there's your answer, okay? Because it's not just lynchings anymore, guys. It's also now they're using fucking planes, right, to drop bombs upon African American residents and citizens. And this is going to be the reason why African Americans are just going to get the hell out of the South. Because why? There are better opportunities, right, in the North. And then on top of that, when these African American soldiers come home, okay, oftentimes they are disembarking on certain Navy port towns. And one of the most popular Navy ports that they disembark on was in New York, okay? Now, if you think about it, if you're a single African American soldier who just came home from war, and you had your choice of either to go back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, or to stay in New York, what would you choose? I would choose New York as well, right? Yes, so that's one of the reasons why New York City is going to become somewhat the mecca of Black culture and Black society. It's simply because you have a lot of African American soldiers coming back home from the war, and New York City was one of the port somewhat destination where African Americans exited from the war, and they just decided, you know what, I'm going to stick around here because why the hell would I want to go back to the South, right? So that's what you have. But yeah, these are some other images from the Tulsa riot itself. And yes, the Great Migration, you could even extend it into 1970, okay? During the post-war as well, right? African Americans leaving the South, okay, for better opportunities. And again, if you're asking the question, why New York? It's simply because New York was a port destination where naval ships often dock at. And as a result, you have African Americans exiting from New York City, and they simply decided that they are going to stay. And this is where you are going to have this powerful cultural expression from African Americans during the 1920s as well. Because if you guys remember, when we started this somewhat African American experience, I used the Ku Klux Klan as somewhat a way to dive into talking about African Americans. And during the 1920s, basically what you have is a cultural clash, right? It's a cultural clash between a lot of different groups. And as a response to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, African Americans are also empowered, they are emboldened, and they are going to offer their own somewhat expression, right? As a response to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, because African Americans are not going to allow and tolerate the Ku Klux Klan to dictate and shape public perception of themselves. African Americans are going to somewhat African Americans are going to take upon themselves, right, to express themselves and define who they were as a group of people. Okay? So this is a clap back to somewhat the Klan, and this is African Americans saying, no, we're not going to let you somewhat dictate and define who we are, right? We will do that for ourselves because African Americans believe in themselves. They have been through somewhat, war, right? They have fought for somewhat democracy, and ultimately, once they come home, they are going to somewhat respond and express themselves, right, against somewhat the rise of white supremacy in America. And this is where you get the Harlem Renaissance, right? This powerful cultural expression of Black culture, Black society, Black literature, Black music, Black poets, Black everything, guys, right? It's a powerful cultural expression to let white America know what it means to be Black in America. And what it means to be Black in America, right, in the 1920s, in the Harlem Renaissance, is instead of historically being defined as being lazy, inferior, and somewhat dangerous and ugly, right? The Harlem Renaissance is a powerful cultural expression to white America to let them know that African Americans see themselves as beautiful, as powerful, okay? Sophisticated, civilized, and equal, okay? That's what the Harlem Renaissance is about, guys, if you are somewhat interested. But unfortunately, we don't have enough time to really dive deep into what the Harlem Renaissance represent, but I will provide to you a link if you are interested. It is a powerful cultural expression of Black power. Black is beautiful, right? Black is power, okay? And if you're wondering, where did that ideology come from? It's not a coincidence, guys. Marcus Garvey, right? Marcus Garvey is going to become the embodiment of that cultural, that Black cultural expression of power. Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, let me give you a little backdrop about him. Born in Jamaica, Marcus Garvey left for school at a very early age to help out his family economic struggle by working as a printer and a printer in the newspaper business, where he became involved in politics. He felt dissatisfied with his work. Marcus Garvey left and he traveled to London in 1912, where he stayed there for 2 years, where he was exposed and became inspired by what we call the Black socialists. These were Black writers who were arguing on the behalf of Black freedom and also the decolonization of the African continent. So you have Black socialists, Black writers, right, calling for speaking on the behalf against colonialism, right, during World War I. So he's inspired by like the writing of these Black socialists in Europe. But there is one book, right? No other book that is going to be more influential upon Marcus Garvey than this book that was titled Up from Slavery. And you will never guess who wrote this book, Up from Slavery, that has such a profound impact on Marcus Garvey. It's Booker T. Washington, right? This is why I say it's going to come back to Booker T. Washington, guys, right? Up from Slavery, in which Booker T. Washington calls upon African Americans to improve their economic situation, first through self-help, and ultimately they could prove to white people that they deserve to be treated as equal. So he really likes this message of hard work, right? Perseverance, okay? From Booker T. Washington. He loved it so much that Marcus Garvey wanted to meet Washington for himself. So he decided to immigrate to America in 1916, but by the time that he gets to America, it was simply too late. Booker T. Washington had died in 1915, but Booker T. Washington's death is also going to be an opportunity for Marcus Garvey, because you think about it, Booker T. Washington is dead. So what that means is the mantle that Booker T. Washington created, or at least the ideology that Booker T. Washington created, now needs a successor. And who should that successor be other than Marcus Garvey himself? And as a result, Marcus Garvey is going to somewhat take up this mantle of what? Of economic improvements, right? Hard work, right? As a way to somewhat build his following. And as a result, Marcus Garvey, he traveled around America, and it became clear to Marcus Garvey that despite the contributions that African Americans had made during World War I, they were still not treated as equal. So Marcus Garvey, he was a powerful, dynamic speaker, and he called upon Blacks to rise up, right? Rise up. And he called upon the Negro race, right? He said the Negro race became a race of slaves was not the fault of God. It was the fault of the race itself. He says, look, the reason why you were enslaved, it's because, again, right? It was not God, but it was our fault. And that he says that salvation would result only when their own exertion and not from concessions to whites. And only then will African Americans truly be free. So what is he doing, guys? If you think about it, this is the genius of Marcus Garvey, right? He's taking a little bit of everything, right? A little bit from everybody, okay? He's influenced by Booker T. Washington. So he says, look, I'll take some of your ideology, right? Hard work, okay? Economic independence, okay? Freedom. But he's also borrowing a little bit from the Black socialist writer in Europe. This idea of Black power, Black nationalism, okay? And also, he's coming up with a solution. This is where he differs a little bit from Booker T. Washington and many of the other somewhat affluent, influential Black leaders. W.E.B. Du Bois. You got A. Philip Randolph, who was the leader of the largest Black labor union in America, okay? Marcus Garvey, his solution is quite simple. If you understand that white America does not like you, and if you understand the history, right, between the relationship between white and Black, it has not been good, right? The whites were the colonizer, the whites were the slave master, the whites hate us for who we are, then why the hell do you want to keep being part of their society, right? That's the argument that Marcus Garvey is making, is that ultimately he's making an argument we have to invest in ourselves, right? Support one another. And this is going to be the reason why Marcus Garvey, he's going to open up his own newspaper. He's going to open up his own restaurant. He's going to open up his own somewhat factory, right? Clothing factory, because, you needed the uniforms, right? But he is going to instill a sense of Black power within the African-American community. And his solution to America's race problem is a little different from Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and A. Philip Randolph. His solution to America's race problem is not integration, meaning that Black America should not strive to become part of white America, because why? White America will never accept us for who we are. White America will never somewhat welcome us, right? It's kind of like, back in the day, that there's a party happening, right? But that you're not invited, right? Because you don't get along with the host. Then the question becomes, if you're not invited and the host hates you, why do you want to go to the party? That's kind of argument that Marcus Garvey is making. And guys, if you're not invited to somebody's party, it's okay. Because why? What's the next best thing? Throw your own fucking party. Okay? You don't need somebody to invite you to their party, right? If you don't like, it kind of reminds me when the Warriors won the championship back in, I think, 2017, right? And I remember typically when you win a championship, you get invited to the White House, but the Warriors made it quite clear that they had no intentions of going to the White House. And I remember President Trump was saying, well, I didn't invite them in the first place, right, to come to the White House. And I remember Steph Curry saying, well, it's okay because even if you did, I'm not even going to go in the first place. Right? So that's kind of Marcus Garvey's somewhat approach. He didn't believe that integration was the solution to America's race problem. If anything, it's quite the opposite. He believed that Black America should do everything they can to separate themselves from white America. If you separate yourself from white America and you keep somewhat the money from within and you help out each other, help out one another, support Black businesses and Black workers and Black institutions and Black communities, right? We support one another. And this is the power to Marcus Garvey because his message went beyond just self-help, guys. His message was Black pride, but most importantly, self-reliance, right? Separation, not integration. And ultimately, it's about Black nationalism, right? It's about having pride in African-American heritage, African-American community, and also it's about ownership, okay? It's about ownership, owning your own businesses, owning your own communities, your cities, and eventually a nation, okay? This is where, once again, it's a regurgitation of the Back to Africa movement. Okay, because Marcus Garvey is going to make an argument that maybe African Americans should go back to where they belong, because only in Africa, where ultimately the Black man in America could be in power. And he does project a sense of power, guys, because again, if you think about what's happening in the 1920s, right, you got the Ku Klux Klan marching out on the street, right? They're not even hiding, right? They don't have their robes on and everything. But if you look at Marcus Garvey, he's kind of like the response to that, because Marcus Garvey projects a sense of power for Blacks, okay? I mean, look at this man, right? Look at what he's wearing, right? It looks like he's a general who is ready to go to war for his people. He never showed himself, right, in any sense of somewhat a poverty or weakness, or weakness. Always project a sense of Black power, right? So he looks like a general that's ready to go to war here. And if you guys remember, when we talked about that parade, right, that the Ku Klux Klan had down in Washington, D.C., the UNIA, guys, the United Negro Improvement Association, this was the organization that Marcus Garvey founded, right, to fight on African Americans and their rights, if you will. They also held a parade too in New York, and thousands, tens of thousands of people showed up to support the UNIA. And I really love this parade because they had a card, and one of the signs, it reads, "The new Negro has no fear." The new Negro was a term that was used to describe the new Black powerful consciousness that was somewhat, that represented the mentality of African Americans during the 1920s. It's a powerful cultural expression from Black America. It's basically giving the middle finger to white America that we are not scared, right? At least we are marching out in the street and we are not hiding behind pillow sheets, if you will, right? So I really love somewhat this New York parade that the UNIA put on. And guys, I mean, you want to talk about uniforms? Okay, the Ku Klux Klan got their uniforms, which is bed sheets. Yeah, these guys ain't rolling around in bed sheets. Okay, they are suited and booted from head to toe, guys. Right? Look at their uniform, right? They are projecting a sense of power, right, to the American public, to empower African Americans to fight on their behalf of Black power and Black nationalism. You got uniforms, you got plumes, you got swords, you got guns, you got flags, right? You got anthems, you got slogans, right? It's quite an incredible show that the UNIA put on. And also, what makes Marcus Garvey very powerful as well was that his ideology was appealing across all classes, in the African American community. Okay? The idea of hard work, that appeals to all African Americans, right? Like the idea of just like hard work. Okay? The idea of Black nationalism, that appeals to the more somewhat liberal-minded, the more progressive segment of the Black population. Black nationalism, right? You also have Black Christianity. Marcus Garvey also understood that majority of his following, or African Americans in America, were Christians. But he kind of just took Christianity and just kind of somewhat gave it a little bit of flavor in the sense that he made the argument that why does Jesus have to be white, right? Because I mean, you know, you think about Jesus, he's from the Middle East, y'all, right? So why does he need to have blonde hair and blue eyes? And why can't he be a person of color? So you have Black Jesus, and if Jesus is Black, then what does that say about his mother Mary? And that's where you have the concept of the Black Madonna. So you have this concept of Black Christianity. So he's covering all his bases all around, right? He's got a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of nationalism, a little bit of somewhat of hard work, uplift, all mixed in one. But what makes him powerful, again, guys, is his legacy. This idea that African Americans need to unite, okay? Invest in themselves, right? Invest in their communities, okay? Empower themselves. And then the solution to America is what? Not integration, but separation. Because again, why do you strive to be part of a society that does not welcome you? And that is why Marcus Garvey is not going to be very well liked by W.E.B. Du Bois. He's also not going to be very well liked by Philip A. Randolph because he is viewed as too militant, too radical, and he's too dangerous. But if you look at his following, Marcus Garvey built one of the largest Black organizations in American history in the 20th century. More than 3 million members, subscribing members, meaning that they are paying to be part of his organization, okay? More than 3 million members across all of the states, 30 branches throughout America, all subscribing to this message of self-reliance, okay? Rejection of integration, and the link between the struggle in America and overseas, with what was happening in Africa, right? Black nationalism. And as a result, this is why Marcus Garvey is going to become so powerful, okay? So powerful that he will inspire others way after he is gone. So I don't know how many of you are reading the Malcolm X book, but if you remember in the Malcolm X book, right, Malcolm X's father, the reason why they moved around so much was because Earl Little, right, got into a lot of trouble with his white neighbors because why? Malcolm X's father was a Garveyite, okay? So if you look at the lineage, Malcolm X, his father, Marcus Garvey, and Malcolm X is going to inspire Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael, SNCC, CORE, okay? So if you look at some of the most militant, radical, powerful, somewhat rejection of white America that has ever somewhat occurred in American history in the 20th century, who can we credit that to? Let's see, okay, so you got SNCC, CORE, Black Panther, inspired by Malcolm X. Malcolm X inspired by the Nation of Islam, which is kind of similar to Marcus Garvey, and also his father, who was a believer of Marcus Garvey. And what did I tell you was the biggest influence on Marcus Garvey? Booker T. Washington. It's funny how that works out, right, guys? So again, is it the ideology? Is it the legacy? Is it the actual achievement that we should measure an individual by, right? I hope you understand the complexity. All right, so that kind of wraps it up here for somewhat the first half of this lecture, guys, right? In the second half of this lecture, we're gonna look at somewhat the progression of African Americans in the 1930s, and we're gonna try to make our way all the way up to the civil rights. All right, guys, thank you for watching the first half of this week's lecture. I will see you in the second half. Thanks, guys, bye.